In a quiet town where nothing ever seemed to happen, one shocking moment changed everything. 90-year-old Leroy Jackson, a proud black veteran who had once stared down bullets on the battlefield, was simply trying to buy a loaf of bread when a group of teenagers decided to turn him into a joke. They mocked his age, sneered at his veteran cap, and then, with no warning, shoved him to the ground like he was nothing. Onlookers gasped, unsure whether to help or just record with their phones. But what those teenagers didn't realize was that someone had already made a silent call. Because in just 20 minutes, the same man they laughed at would be standing tall again, this time surrounded by an unbreakable wall of Marines, Navy SEALs, and veterans who had served, bled, and lost brothers just like Leroy. What began as a cruel act of disrespect would soon erupt into a powerful demonstration of unity, justice, and redemption that the whole town, and soon the whole internet, would never forget. It was a quiet afternoon in a sleepy town just outside San Diego, the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their porches and people left their front doors unlocked. The sun shone bright, glinting off parked car windows and casting long golden beams across the cracked sidewalks. Birds chirped from telephone wires overhead, and the breeze carried the faint scent of fresh, cut grass and orange blossoms. At the corner of Maple and 4th, nestled between a barber shop and a laundromat, stood a modest little convenience store. It had been there for decades, its faded red awning in hand, painted open, sign giving it a charm that modern stores couldn't replicate. Inside, the aisles were narrow, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old newspapers, and the cashier, Mrs. Linda, had worked there since 1982, at exactly 3:17 p.m. The bell above the door jingled as Leroy Jackson stepped inside. Leroy was 90 years old, and had lived a life that deserved volumes. He walked with a slight limp from a war wound he never spoke much about, and he leaned on a wooden cane hand, carved by a fellow Marine he once saved in Korea. His back was hunched from time and toil, but his bearing was still unmistakably dignified. Every movement he made carried the ghost of discipline, and his presence, though quiet, always drew respect. He wore a clean flannel shirt tucked into pressed slacks, and atop his silver curls sat a cap that read, Korean War Veteran. The stitching had faded, but the pride hadn't. Leroy wasn't in a rush. He took his time choosing a loaf of wheat bread and a small carton of milk. He chatted briefly with Mrs. Linda, who smiled warmly and told him to take care of those old bones. He chuckled in return, offering a wink. But as he stepped outside into the sunshine, the mood shifted. Blocking the store's narrow exit stood 3 teenage boys. Loud, rowdy, and clearly trying to entertain themselves, they leaned against the doorframe with chips in hand and fake bravado in their voices. Their music blared from a speaker dangling from one of their backpacks. One of them, tall with slicked back hair and a mocking grin, looked at Leroy and laughed. "Move it, Grandpa," he barked, puffing out his chest. Leroy stopped, caught off guard, but not shaken. His eyes remained kind. "Excuse me, boys," he said with calm grace, just trying to get through. Another teen, shorter but mean-eyed, squinted at his cap and snorted. "What's that say? Veteran of the Dynasty, or age? What war was that prehistoric?" The third, who hadn't said a word yet, chuckled nervously, glancing around as a few pedestrians began to notice. Some slowed their steps, watching the scene unfold. Leroy didn't flinch. He adjusted his grip on his cane and took a small step forward. "Please," he said again, still patient, still dignified, but they weren't interested in patience or dignity. The tall one leaned forward and, in one sudden movement, shoved Leroy square in the chest. The world seemed to slow down. Leroy stumbled, his cane slipping from his hand. His body twisted awkwardly as he fell backward, his hip hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. The milk carton burst beside him, its contents mixing with the dust. Gasps erupted from the bystanders. One woman screamed. A man started toward him, but too late. The teens were already laughing, pointing, swaggering off down the block as though they'd just pulled a harmless prank. "Chill out," one of them called over his shoulder. "He'll bounce back." But Leroy didn't bounce. He winced as he pushed himself up slightly. Pain etched across his face. A young woman rushed to his side, offering help, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm okay," Leroy grunted, clearly not okay. Across the street, inside a parked black SUV, a man in sunglasses slowly put down his coffee. His eyes had been locked on the scene from the beginning. He hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked when the shove happened. Master Gunnery Sergeant Malik Reeves, retired Marine and former Special Ops, had been sitting there to pick up a package for his niece. But now his posture changed. He reached into the center console, pulled out a battered phone, and made a single call. No shouting, no horn, blowing, no threats, just 3 words, code Patriot, now. And with that, the clock began ticking. Inside the black SUV, Master Gunnery Sergeant Malik Reeves sat perfectly still, the engine humming softly beneath him. The windows were slightly tinted, and from his vantage point he could see everything. He hadn't moved a muscle when the old man fell. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched around the steering wheel, and a quiet storm brewed behind his eyes. Malik was no ordinary man. He had served in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. He didn't scare easy, didn't react emotionally, and had long ago learned the power of restraint. But what he had just witnessed stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years, a white, hot surge of fury. Not because he saw an old man fall, but because he saw a Marine fall, and not just any Marine. Leroy Jackson was a name whispered with reverence in military circles. Stories about him were told at boot camps and in bunkers. He was one of the few surviving black veterans from the Korean War who had once led a platoon up a snowy hill with nothing but a rifle and grit. Leroy had saved more lives than most could count. He had stood tall when the world tried to push him down, on the battlefield and back home, where racism wore civilian clothes. More personally, Malik had served under Captain Elijah Jackson, Leroy's son, during a mission in Helmand Province. Elijah was tough, brilliant, and brave, a chip off the old block, and when Elijah was killed in action during a failed drone extraction, Leroy personally flew overseas to receive his son's body. Malik never forgot that moment, the silence, the salute, the pain masked behind steel eyes. So when Malik saw those punk kids lay hands on the father of the man who once saved his life, he didn't yell. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a black flip phone, one that didn't connect to any modern network, and flipped it open. It only had 5 contacts. He pressed one. A secure line answered with a static hum. Malik spoke only 2 words, code Patriot, no last names. No context, that was all it took. The other voice simply said, received. Then the wheels began turning. Within minutes, his message had spread through encrypted veteran group chats, private messenger apps, and old-school phone trees that hadn't been used in years. It hit retired Navy SEALs in Texas, a former Army Ranger in Los Angeles, and a Marine Recon Unit leader teaching high school gym in Nevada. The words Code Patriot weren't just an alert. They were a call to arms, a sacred oath whispered among veterans who promised to protect their own. No matter what, no matter when. In under 10 minutes, cameras from a bank across the street and a traffic light nearby had already identified the teens. Facial recognition software, courtesy of one of Malik's ex-CA friends, pinged names, addresses, and recent social media activity. The 3 boys were tagged, tracked, and locked in. A retired cyber intelligence officer uploaded their photos into a secure veterans only thread. No public leaks, no threats, just awareness and preparation. Back across the street, Leroy had managed to sit up with the help of a young woman named Carly. She was a college student on spring break, visibly shaken by what she'd just witnessed. His cap had fallen in the dirt, and when Carly picked it up, she paused. Beneath the brim, stitched in faded thread, were the words, 3rd Infantry Chosin Reservoir. "Sir," she said softly, placing it back on his head, "you okay?" Leroy adjusted it with a grimace, brushing dirt from his slacks, took a grenade in 52, took 2 bullets in 68. This, he exhaled. This ain't gonna stop me. Someone nearby offered to call an ambulance. Another person pulled out their phone to record. Leroy waved them off. "No need for flashing lights," he said. "Just help me get up." But he wasn't rising alone. Unknown to him, others were already on their way. Across town, a retired drill instructor revved his truck. In another neighborhood, a Marine with prosthetic legs finished lacing up his boots. A squad of veterans gathered silently outside a VFW hall, already in motion before anyone told them what to do. It wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. It was about letting the world know, you do not lay a hand on a Marine and walk away laughing. Not when the Corps still breathes, not when brotherhood still matters, not while men like Malik Reeves are still watching. The teenagers thought they'd gotten away with it. They were still laughing as they strolled down the cracked sidewalks, passing graffiti, tagged buildings, and trash bins. The tall one only clutched a bag of chips and recounted the shove with exaggerated flair, arms waving, mimicking Leroy's fall like it was a scene from a comedy sketch. The second one, Ty, shorter and mean-eyed, snorted as he scrolled through his phone. I think someone filmed it, bro. We're gonna be famous. The third boy, Marcus, the quietest of the bunch, chuckled half-heartedly but kept glancing back toward the store, visibly less comfortable than the others. He had grown up in a military family, and something about what just happened didn't sit right. They reached the skate park a few blocks away, a sun-baked concrete pit nestled between a chain-link fence and a row of dry, wilting bushes. It was usually empty this time of day, except for a few local skaters. They dropped their backpacks and took their usual spot at the wooden bench near the rail. Bags of chips opened, music played. Life, as far as they were concerned, was business as usual. But they didn't notice the sedans, trucks, and motorcycles slowly filling up the parking lot and surrounding streets. The vehicles were nothing special: an old Ford pickup, a dented minivan, a spotless Dodge Charger, but each held someone who had seen combat. Some were in faded camo jackets, others in black T-shirts or civilian clothes, their postures unmistakably straight. They didn't shout, they didn't run, they took positions. By the time the teens were halfway through their snacks, the air had shifted subtly but unmistakably. The birds had stopped chirping, the breeze felt heavier, and the sound of approaching boots was unmistakable if you knew what to listen for. Ty noticed at first. Yo, do you see that? Illy squinted. What old dudes walking their dogs? But Marcus stiffened. Nah, man, look again. Surrounding the skate park, on the sidewalk near the fence across the lot, stood a dozen men and women. Some wore dog tags around their necks. Others had patches on their sleeves. Several stood with arms crossed, eyes fixed on the boys. They weren't yelling, they weren't holding signs, they just stood there, still as statues. Then, through the crowd, a large man approached. He walked with the kind of presence that turned heads before he even spoke. His broad shoulders strained against a simple black polo shirt. His hair was silver, short, cropped, and his mirrored sunglasses reflected nothing but resolve. The sunlight caught the edge of a Marine Corps ring on his finger. He stepped right up to the boys' bench, and when he stopped, everyone else behind him stopped too. Silence fell over the park. You laid hands, he said, voice low and commanding, on a Marine. The boys froze. Illy blinked. What? The man continued, not just a Marine, a war hero, a man who served this country before your parents were even born. Ty stood up, puffing out his chest. Look, man, it was just a joke, was it? The man asked, cutting him off sharply. You shoved a 90. Your old man to the ground, you laughed, you walked away. His voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it was undeniable. A woman in army fatigues stepped up beside him. Her name tag read Rodriguez, and she wore a Bronze Star medal on her chest. You think we're here to scare you, we're here to educate you, she said firmly. Because what you did wasn't just disrespectful, it was disgraceful. Marcus looked down, guilt washing over his face. Around them the gathering grew. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, white, black, Latino, Asian, men and women. Some walked with canes, some had prosthetics, others were young and alert, clearly fresh out of service. But they were united by one thing: you don't hurt your own. Illy glanced around, suddenly unsure of himself. Okay, he said nervously. We didn't mean nothin', all right. But the man in mirrored glasses shook his head slowly. Intent doesn't excuse ignorance, he said, and today, you're going to learn something. The boy's smugness began to melt away. The weight of 100 silent eyes crushed the last traces of arrogance from their faces. "You have two choices," the woman said. "Walk away and stay ignorant, or stand here, look us in the eyes and listen." And for the first time since the incident, the boys didn't have anything clever to say. The storm had gathered, and now it was time for a reckoning. At first, the teens still wore smirks. "What is this, some boot camp cosplay?" Ty snorted, eyeing the obstacle course laid out in the grass. Old tires were lined up like a drill ground. Wooden crates and sandbags formed a low wall. A stack of old boots, extra-large T-shirts, and 40-pound military packs rested nearby. The veterans, now numbering over 24, had assembled everything in under 10 minutes. They hadn't come to fight. They came to educate. The Marine way, Illy crossed his arms, trying to act tough. "What, you guys gonna beat up some kids now?" From the center of the crowd, Malik Reeves stepped forward. He had taken off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that had seen too much, endured too long, and now burned with purpose. "No," he said coolly, "we don't beat children, we teach them." The crowd, now gathering at the edge of the skate park, watched in silence. "You have two choices," Malik continued, voice calm but unyielding. "We call the police, press charges, your faces go viral for the wrong reasons, or," he gestured to the makeshift training zone, "you give us 20 minutes of your time, Marine style." The boys exchanged uneasy looks. Illy hesitated. Ty frowned. Marcus bit his lip. The pressure was on. Everyone was watching. Even the skaters had stopped skating. People had phones out. Some were already live streaming. "You said it was just a joke, right?" said a voice from the back, an older vet in a wheelchair. "Well, let's see if you can laugh through a Marine workout." More chuckles from the crowd, out of pride, or maybe fear of looking weak, the boys agreed. "Fine," Illy huffed, "whatever." And with that the training began. They were made to drop to the dirt, faces in the grass, arms shaking. "Push-ups," barked Gunnery Sergeant Davis, a veteran with arms like tree trunks. "Give me 20, then sprint those tires." They stumbled. They groaned, they sweated. The boots were too big, the backpacks too heavy, the grass too hot. Next came the wind sprints back and forth across the park, while shouting at the top of their lungs, "Respect is earned." When Illy started slacking, a female Marine got in his face, nose to nose. "You think it's funny to mock a man who fought for your right to act like a clown. Move." The onlookers grew. Parents brought their children to watch. One elderly woman crossed herself and whispered, "This is how you raise boys into men." Then came the balancing drill, books on their heads while holding a plank. Ty collapsed. Marcus vomited. Illy fell and cursed. "Language," shouted a former drill instructor. "You're in the presence of service members." Despite the heat, the pain, the humiliation, something started shifting. Slowly the jokes stopped, the smirks faded, and in their place came something new: focus, grit, humility. But then came the twist. A local TV news crew that had been filming a piece about nearby construction happened upon the scene. Within minutes they had their cameras rolling. "We were covering road repairs," said anchorwoman Karen Torres, "but we saw a large crowd, and what we found was something powerful." Within hours, footage of the event, labeled "Veterans Teach Disrespectful Teens a Powerful Lesson Without Violence." It hit social media like a wildfire. Clips of the teens chanting "Respect is earned" in the dirt went viral. People weren't mocking them, they were praising the veterans. One tweet read, "This is how you discipline, no yelling, no violence, just honor, grit, and truth. Semper Fi." Another, "America needs more moments like this. These kids will never forget today." But just as the teens were crawling through the final sandbag tunnel, dirty, exhausted, and panting, a black sedan pulled up quietly beside the park. The doors opened. Out stepped a tall woman in a decorated dress uniform, flanked by two aides. She wore 4 rows of ribbons across her chest and a nameplate that read, "Jackson." She walked directly to Malik and saluted him. "You must be Master Sergeant Reeves." He returned the salute. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Colonel Angela Jackson," she said. "Leroy Jackson is my grandfather." The crowd gasped. The boys froze. Angela's face was calm, but her voice was steel. I came to thank whoever gave these boys the chance to learn honor before the courts had to teach them the hard way. Then she turned to the teens, her eyes unwavering, and now, you're coming with me. There's someone you need to apologize to in person. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm orange hue over the skate park, now transformed into something resembling a sacred ground. The teens lay sprawled on the grass, their clothes soaked with sweat, faces streaked with dirt, and pride thoroughly dismantled. They weren't laughing anymore. Suddenly, the murmurs of the crowd quieted as three figures approached from the far end of the path. Leroy Jackson, 90 years old, but regal as a king, walked slowly between two Marines. One held his elbow, the other carried his cane, though Leroy waved it off after a few steps, choosing instead to walk on his own. The pain in his hip was nothing compared to the fire that steadied his heart. Behind them trailed Colonel Angela Jackson, his granddaughter, her polished boots crunching softly over the gravel, medals shimmering in the golden light. As they entered the circle, the crowd instinctively stood straighter. Phones were lowered, hands fell over hearts. Illy, Ty, and Marcus struggled to their feet, brushing off dirt and uncertainty. Ty's mother had arrived, her eyes red and wild with shame. She had already tried to hug him, to apologize to everyone in sight, but no one approached Leroy yet. He didn't ask for that. He stood in front of the boys, back straight, chest out, the words already forming in his soul. "I was younger than you," Leroy said, voice steady, "when I first learned how to crawl through mud. But I didn't do it for pride or punishment. I did it so people like you could live free." The boys lowered their eyes. "I bled for this country," he continued, "so you'd have the freedom to act right, to do better, to stand for something other than your ego." He paused, letting the silence dig in. Then he looked directly at Illy, the boy who had shoved him. His voice softened. "I don't hate you, son, but you've got a choice. Keep walking the easy path, or earn your way back to dignity." Illy's lips trembled. He wiped his nose and gave a short nod. That's when Malik stepped forward, holding something small in his hand. A weathered velvet box. Leroy took it gently, opening it with fingers that once held a rifle in Korea. Inside lay a replica of the Bronze Star, polished but old. Its inscription read, "For heroic or meritorious achievement in combat." The crowd leaned in. "This," Leroy said, lifting it just slightly, "was awarded to my brother, Elijah Jackson. He died in Korea saving 12 men from an ambush. The real medal is at home, but I carry this replica to remind me what sacrifice means." Then, to everyone's surprise, he turned to Illy and placed the box in the boy's hands. "This doesn't belong to you," Leroy said. "Not yet. Maybe never, but maybe, one day when you earn it, you'll understand the weight of it." Illy was speechless. Tears welled in his eyes. I don't deserve this," he whispered. "You're right," Leroy said with a slight smile. "But now you have something to reach for." For a few moments no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Leroy turned to the veterans, his voice regaining that command tone from decades past. "All right, brothers and sisters, let's march." The veterans didn't hesitate. They formed two lines, crisp and orderly, boots aligned. Leroy looked at the boys. "You coming?" The boys looked at each other, then stepped forward. Ty took his mother's hand, gave it a gentle squeeze, and let go. Marcus wiped his face with his sleeve. Illy clutched the metal box like it was something sacred, and then, shoulder to shoulder, they marched. Down Main Street, past cars that stopped and people who clapped, past store windows and apartment balconies and bus stops. People leaned out of windows and waved. Drivers honked and held their phones up. Children watched wide-eyed, asking their parents, "What's going on?" One mother answered, "That's what redemption looks like, baby." Local news anchors were already broadcasting the scene live. In an extraordinary display of discipline and unity, veterans and teens, once on opposite sides of a disturbing confrontation, now marched together in silence, dignity, and purpose. The image was unforgettable. Veterans in uniform and street clothes, teens in baggy jeans and dirt-stained shirts, old and young, black, white, brown united. 20 minutes earlier, the park had witnessed disrespect. Now it witnessed honor, And in that march step by step, 3 boys began to understand that respect wasn't demanded, it was earned. And they had just taken their first steps toward earning it. What started as a moment of disrespect turned into a powerful lesson that echoed far beyond a small town park. The teenagers who thought they were tough learned that true strength lies not in mocking the weak, but in standing up for what's right. They didn't just walk away with sore muscles, they walked away changed. And in the eyes of the veterans who stood around them, that was a victory far greater than any battle. Leroy Jackson reminded everyone watching on the ground and online that honor doesn't retire with age, and dignity is not something that can be pushed down. It rises, and when one of our heroes is disrespected, an entire brotherhood will rise with him. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more real, powerful, and emotional stories that reveal the hidden truths of human character. Speech balloon comment below. What would you have done if you witnessed that moment? Loudspeaker share this video with someone who needs a reminder that respect is earned, and never optional. Military, and remember, heroes walk among us every day. Some wear uniforms, others wear scars. All of them deserve our gratitude. Thanks for watching Hidden Realities. Until next time, stay kind, stay aware, and stand up for what's right. United States.